Hello everyone, I am Deyasini and I welcome you all to the Stories of the Indian Diaspora series with reference to TMYS Reviews June 2021 project that is inviting stories on the Indian Diaspora. This is basically to investigate the ambition-based movement under our annual theme of migration, resettlement and displacement. We are honored to present Dr. Shobna Nijhawan. She's an associate professor of Hindi in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Linguistics at the York University, Canada. Her book and monograph publications include Women and Girls in the Hindi Public Sphere, Periodical Literature in Colonial North India, and Hindi Publishing in Colonial Lucknow. Her edited books include Nationalism in Vernacular, Hindi, Urdu, and the Literature of the Indian Freedom. We welcome you, ma'am, and a very good morning to you.
Thank you very
Also,
much.
yeah, also, we have Samina Tabassum joining us from the US. She is an associate professor at Erickson Institute in Chicago, where she teaches courses in child development. She has published poems in several international journals of repute. Her poems were performed on stage in 2017 as a part of the Kundiman Foundation, an emotive fusion event focusing on Asian American poetry. In 2018, she was named a semi-finalist for the Kuhn Dolan Brooks Poetry Award in Chicago. We welcome you, Samina, and I would now request you to kindly proceed with your question.
Good morning, Shobna. You and I are both in Central Standard Time, so we're lucky. Shobna, the program is titled "Tell Me Your Story." Stories from the South Asian diaspora. So we wanted you to start with telling us your story. Tell us about your family, how you ended up in Canada, and what that migration story is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Samina. Well, my journey of migration might be adding a little bit of a different dimension to the narratives you've collected so far. I'm the daughter of Punjabi parents who migrated from India to Germany in 1958, my father and my mother in 1970. And I was born in Germany and lived the first 26 years of my life there. So I'm not only the child of first generation Indian immigrants to Germany, but also myself a first generation immigrant as I migrated to the US and later to Canada in the years 2000 and 2005. In North America, my identity as Indo-German, and with that I mean Indian in looks, but German in character, and I guess Indo-German with regard to cultural values crystallized. So I've been living in Canada now since 15 years.
Do you get to travel back to India? Did your family, go back and forth between Germany and India?
Yes, we did every 3 years at Christmas break. We went for a 3-week visit to Delhi. Yes,
and were your parents the sole siblings that traveled west, or were most of your family located in India?
The majority and the older generation were all back in India, and only a few siblings had immigrated to Great Britain, the States, and this one son to Germany. Yeah.
Thank you.
And now, I mean, after school, after I left my home, I traveled to India regularly too. Now, lately, of course not. It's not been possible. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, Shobna, be it first or be it second generation, migrants always experience multiple tension and exclusion as a result of the interplay of diasporic transnationalism, cultural assimilation, and the intersecting importance of racialization in their lives. And yet, as reflexive actors, they respond by crafting their own position belongings. And having been trained in the languages, literatures, and linguistics, how difficult or easy has it been for you to enable the articulation of the self?
Mhm. Growing up in Germany, I never felt truly German. I tried my best, but clearly I was not considered German. At the same time, India has never been a home for me. It was surely the homeland of my parents. So this understanding of homeland is not that prominent in my thinking because Germany is my home. And to this day, I dream in German. German is the language I do mental math in and count in. It's the language my family speaks to this day. In sports, I root for Germany. So I am German. And yet, of course, the Indian side of my identity or of myself is prominent as much in my personal as also in my professional life.
Thank you.
So
Should I elaborate or did I miss something?
you want to? You want to? Do you want to?
No, not necessarily.
Oh,
I'm just trying to, yeah,
okay,
to
okay,
provide the context.
okay, okay. What were the problems that initially you had faced when you migrated to Canada, and what were the cultural adjustments that you had to make, and also how would you define uh, the very concept of home and how you have uh, recreated home in a place that is so far away from your homeland.
Oh God, I should have brought something to write everything down.
Okay.
We'll have to go step by step. Um, so now we're not talking about me living in Germany, but coming to Canada. So, okay, I came as a very privileged person to Canada.
Okay.
I had a permanent resident status that I got before I even entered. I had a job
Okay.
that allowed me to come to Canada with that privileged status. And even my North America wasn't new to me because I'd lived 5 years in the United States before. And even there, I had a student visa, and I didn't have any problems with regard to legal status. So, and in terms, I mean, culturally, North America and Europe or Germany are very different, I find. But being so privileged, the adjustments, I, I, it just came naturally, I would think. I mean, home, I've always been carrying my home with me. I can't really say where it begins. And I always think of this, I learned this from my teacher, Trin Min Ha, a feminist theorist and post-colonial studies scholar, artist, and filmmaker who wrote about her experience um, with a title of a lecture of hers titled "Far Away from Home," and there was a comma between "far away from home." So, and regularly she said this comma was either forgotten or taken as a spelling error. But her point is that you can be far away while also being home. So on that note, my home is with me and it's where I live. And yes, it is here in Canada. But when I travel to Germany, I'm also going home at the same time. Now I'm sure I missed a lot of other things. But yeah.
What are the things that you miss the most?
From Germany or from India?
From both, from Germany, from India.
I don't miss things because I'm so connected to Germany.
Okay.
I mean, when I listen to the news, I listen to German news. I read the German papers online, and my friends are in Germany. So I feel once I'm back in Germany, I'm back home. Yeah, so I might miss a certain food or a certain person, but I don't. I'm just fine where I am, and I can. Yeah, and I don't have these problems that others face in terms of racism because, yeah, I'm just a privileged scholar who has a regular income. I mean.
Well, this is fascinating. I must say, Shobna, before this interview, I read your material, your academic text. I would have never guessed that you had these roots in Germany. So your academic, and it's interesting because I actually taught at Göttingen for one semester, and I always thought it was interesting.
Where?
Someone from the Göttingen, right above near Hanover. Yeah, so for a very short amount of time. And I just remember just feeling displaced myself as a South Asian American, going into Europe, which seems to me very different from my upbringing here in the United States. But I read your academic material and it is wonderful. It's amazing. It's so intellectually rich. And I want to focus now on your book that was published in 2012, Women and Girls in the Hindi Public Sphere. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with Shobna's work, she focuses on periodicals in the early 1900s, in particular in Lucknow. And you're looking at these periodicals very carefully with both a horizontal and vertical analysis. And you're looking at perhaps, I think, whether these periodicals led to the Gandhian revolution, right? And the discourse that was created in the public sphere. The first question I wanted to ask was your focus in your academic work is really on how these periodicals portray women and girls. And in particular, you focus on periodicals with an emphasis for the female reader. And you had talked about in your book as to how people thought that was inferior academic work. Why would you focus on periodicals that were, aimed for the female reader? But yet your book is so rich in terms of how these periodicals position women and girls. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about that background. Were you raised by strong women, and what led you to, research the role and portrayal of women and girls in periodicals?
No, I wasn't raised by strong women, or it was, I think, more of a coincidence that I got to that topic because in the early 2000s, when I was doing my graduate work, my supervisor was involved in projects of digitizing primary sources and periodicals. And up to then, periodical literature wasn't really considered real literature. Those were monographs. So she had gotten funds from certain North American libraries to travel and collect periodical literature in archives. And so I got to work with this first batch of primary sources. It wasn't, to be honest, that I wanted to write or understand the Indian feminist movement or Indian women's movement. We didn't even know what was out there. And I had to travel to so many different archives and I literally had to find the periodicals because they were often not shelved properly. They were often, the issues had fallen behind the shelves, and I would find them in a corner behind and look at them completely dusted, brittled, and everything. And even the librarians told me, we have these wonderful Hindi literary periodicals. We have Sudha, work with these other ones. They're all in the shelves. But so I just had to find them, and seeing how rich they were, it was clear that I had to write about that. About it's not only writings for women, but for the most part, the periodicals were edited by women. Of course, very privileged women, many of them from the Nehru family, for example, but they were written by women, for women, and engaged with a lot of literate everyday women in their different columns. And now I guess again I forgot what I should be responding to.
So looking at this idea of examining women and female periodicals in particular that were written by women for women, and you had talked about how you weren't raised by strong women, which is kind of interesting, but that this was just a coincidence as to how you stumbled upon these periodicals. Can I ask you a little bit about what your analysis said about how women were portrayed? You talked a lot about, for example, the narrative of the good Indian woman. So could you talk a little bit about what your research led to, what conclusions you came up with in terms of the themes and patterns you noticed in these periodicals?
Well, what I noticed was, yes, there was a certain mainstream narrative on how women ought to be. And that was a narrative that many male writers also promoted in their literature, if we think of, well, of Prem Chand, for example. But there was also a lot of room to bend these norms. And what I investigate is how these women's periodicals, and there were also children's and girls' periodicals that were published at that time, how they became a medium for a certain class of women, mostly elite and middle class women, to think in new idioms and to express themselves collectively in this period that is so marked by social and political transition, by political emancipation, and by this emerging nationalist feminist thought. So often, what could not be said or published elsewhere could be published in these specifically women targeted periodicals. So that's then what I do. I trace this development of this political emancipation. And this doesn't necessarily mean that women want to reject traditional roles or question these roles, but they're just negotiating them all the times in their writing, in their thinking, and in their activism as well.
Thank you. My next question has to deal with your focus on periodicals as a whole. Many of the writers that we're looking at are, writing in prose or poetry. And here you are addressing periodicals. If you've ever traveled through India, we know that the masses in India consume periodicals. Yeah. And I grew up with a grandfather who would get the local periodical and sit in the charpoi, right, underneath the mango tree in Hyderabad and read aloud the periodicals in Urdu at that time, growing up as a child. And then when my parents immigrated here to Chicago, we would go to the local grocery stores and we would pick up the Urdu periodicals that my parents then read here and read aloud what was happening back home, but also read a lot of information about entertainment, domestic science, even matrimonials, right? And so I wanted you to talk about, what role do periodicals play in the Indian diaspora?
That's so nice how you mentioned how you pick these periodicals and read them out, because this idea, reading is not a solitary moment, especially not with periodicals. And even if issue numbers, if circulation was maybe 1,000 per issue, it reached so many more people because they were read out aloud, especially women's periodicals were read out aloud and passed on to the neighbors and everything. Yeah. So, like you already said, in the diaspora and in all the ethnic food stores, in religious spaces, there are a lot of periodicals that can be accessed freely, free of cost. And of course, they're full with advertisements. But I just have a graduate student who's working on periodicals in the diaspora that are, but I don't know enough about the reader demographic of diaspora periodicals because, of course, it'll depend on the script that they're published in. And the ideological background, I guess. I haven't done research on contemporary diaspora periodical literature. I am just passionate about the early 20th century. That's where I get stuck.
So it's interesting. You talk about analyzing these periodicals from a horizontal level and a vertical level. Do you want to explain a little bit about what that theoretical framework is?
Yeah, I can. It was just, I think it's really important not just to pick essays and contributions. I mean, the periodical consists of so many subgenres, but I decided to treat the periodical as a periodical that communicates within the pages of a single issue. So with horizontal, I meant when I started my research, I read through every periodical from the first to the last page. Next issue, first, last page. So that was my horizontal reading of periodicals to see developments. But then, if I wanted to see how a certain topic, let's say suffrage movement or indentured labor, how a certain topic developed or certain gender roles developed, I would choose a vertical reading to see what was happening in the early 1910s. What was the main type of short stories that were published in the early 1910s as compared to the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So I have a broad span that I could look at. How are women's roles changing? How are cultural norms being negotiated over the decades? But at the same time, because it was important to me to write in the second book, to write a biography of a journal. Of course, I had to also consult everything horizontally. And this included all the advertisements in the periodical, what type of public sphere they were coming out of, and whom they were corresponding with.
Thank you. Yeah, Sani, I think if you want to go on to the next question.
Ma'am, if you would comment on the polyphonic nature of these periodicals in an environment marked by social reforms, the anti-colonial sentiment, and emerging nationalist and feminist thought to instigate a redemptive invigoration of life in rediscovering the self, to be vocal about the orthodoxies of cultural history of womanhood without uh, succumbing to it with a humiliating sense of baseless resignation.
Mhm. Well, the women writers in women periodicals, of course, had to be careful in what they were saying. They had to, and they were not radicals. They just wanted to broaden horizons of thinking. And the women's periodical genre was a relatively safe space to do so. It did not underlie in terms of political dissent. It was never affected by censorship laws because, of course, women's periodicals weren't considered political enough. Yet there was a lot of political commentary in the journals as well. But very often presenting radical thought, if we want to call it that way, was relatively safely done in fiction or in poetry. Of course, the women writers always knew that not just women were their audiences. And one can also tell from advertisements. I mean, it's in both of the, not only in women's periodicals, but also in the mainstream periodicals, there were sections for women where women got to write, but they were, of course, aware. So, what I think is important to me is that the women themselves, are formulating new idioms in which they express themselves collectively. So women speaking on behalf of other women, but also individually, and formulating this sense of the self, if you want to say it. So.
Thank you, ma'am. Over to you, Samina.
Thank you. So Shobna, early on we were talking about how periodicals are very much a communal literacy event, right? And somebody in the household goes and gets the local paper and they sit and read aloud. It leads to a lot of debate and dialogue. Having lived in India, I witnessed people in the market debating from what was in a periodical. But yet here you've written these books in which your research is really archival research as a methodology. And archival research can be a very lonely endeavor. So we were interested in talking to you about your interest in archival research, what that looks like in terms of methodology, and what kind of a mindset and disposition do you need to sustain yourself with years and years of archival research?
Oh, I just love these sources. Are just, I on my first sabbatical, when I started working on the second book, it's not just that I'm so passionate about South Asian studies as an academic discipline, but I just love these sources. And I was trying to feel how it might have felt for someone to read these sources and to wait for the next issue to appear, to continue on that series that was being published. Yes, I was alone all the times, and I wake up in the morning, I go to the archive, or if I got to get photocopies or microfilm, I could go to a library, or for the second book, I got everything on microfilm digitized. Sudha was digitized from the university, from the Library of Congress in Washington. So I could access this here from my university library. It didn't feel lonely to me because, I mean, this literature was just speaking to me all the time. So, and it was exciting, it was fascinating. I also never came in with a set of questions on what I wanted to find. I can truly say that I just let myself be guided by what I got to read. And that is why, I don't know whether you've seen, I have so many different types of literature, of essays on a variety of topics that are all found in these periodicals. So I did these little things about advertisements, about Indian tea advertisements, whatever came and excited me. That's what I started writing about. And of course, the visuals, looking at all the visuals and how they were presenting a different narrative. But no, I never felt lonely. And one other reason, perhaps, is that so much in the 2000s and 2010s, so much scholarly literature has been produced by scholars who are also working with primary sources, and there was just so many ways to connect.
Did you ever go back to Lucknow or in other cities in India to look at the primary periodicals themselves?
Yes. Yeah.
And what was that like? Was that easy access? Okay, was that easy for you to access those periodicals?
No, it wasn't easy, but it was possible. It just takes a lot of patience. I mean, you need I came with letters from my university requesting access to the archives, especially in Allahabad. But I was not the first such scholar who has been doing this. So all you need is time, patience, and then it's just wonderful to sit in the reading room. You're always at the grace of the librarian. He might not be there or she, but then you just wait. But no, then at some point, if you can communicate your passion, even though if at first you're greeted awkwardly, wondering why does she want to look at that? So at some point, I mean, I could talk to the librarian or to the staff in the libraries and archives and tell them about a recipe that I had just read from 1910. You know, they have low fat laddu recipes in the 1910 issue. Did you know that? So then, so there was so much I could talk about to connect with them. Or if one of the Sri Darpan was published from Allahabad, and I was in Allahabad doing the archival research, so I knew certain places through those old sources, and yeah, I could always connect. But yeah, it is tiresome. It's hot. The libraries, vernacular libraries, are not don't have AC, and they're if power is out, it's really hot. But you sit there. There were other students, other readers who I guess read more contemporary literature. I was not alone in that sense. Yeah.
Thank you. You have to send me the recipe for that low-fat laddu, though. That is well worth the trip to the library.
The recipes were wonderful, and I mean, I learned a lot about Ayurvedic uh, healing practices and oils, and yeah, those were my favorite columns.
Thank you. Our next question, I think, is me again. And so my next question is, now that I know your background as someone who identifies as Indo-German, but yet you are reading periodicals in Hindi along with other languages like Urdu. So can you tell me a little bit about your own multilingualism, when and how you gained literacy in these languages? Do you feel you're fully bilingual or multilingual? And how do you navigate your own linguistic identity between and among multiple languages?
Yeah. So it was important to my parents growing up in Germany that my father spoke German with me and my mother spoke English with me, and my parents communicated in Punjabi. So my mother tongue clearly is German. I could understand Punjabi. Of course, I was not confident about it. I didn't speak it myself. And in school, I learned other languages. I had to learn French and Latin. So those are the languages I'm comfortable in. And after graduating from high school, I traveled to India because I wanted to deepen my understanding of especially of Hindi. So that's where I traveled, learned the script, learned how to speak, and only then after that I decided that I would want to continue those studies.
So would you say you're fully fluent in Hindi?
Yeah, yeah. I am fluent, or let's say I was fluent in Hindi. I don't dream in Hindi. So it's not, it doesn't go that far. My Hindi at the moment is more of a Hindi from the 1920s. So when I listen to modern media Hindi, it sounds very awkward to me because I'm almost a purist, and even in my teaching of Hindi and Urdu, it's not that I reject English or anything, but I try to encourage students if there are words in Hindi, to use that Hindi. The Hindi in the women's periodicals is the most beautiful language to me, because it is not the standardized Sanskritized Hindi of the official literary language, but a language that women can understand. So for me, that was the most beautiful part. In the second book, I worked with literary journals where the language was much more Sanskritized. But again, there I benefited from my training in Sanskrit that I received in university.
So did you learn Sanskrit and Hindi in India or in Germany?
Hindi and Urdu I learned in India back and forth, but I studied Indology, philology in Germany for years. So that's where most of the training was text-based, original text-based, with Hindi, Urdu, and Sanskrit. And only in 2000, when I did interdisciplinary studies away from philology solely, that's when I got most of the post-colonial theory and the new context and the new perspectives onto texts to actually figure out what to do with them.
Very interesting. I teach linguistics as well, and I often, talk about Hindi and Urdu and the history and how they came about and their recent history, right? The script itself, and how they're kind of like sister languages in some ways, but yet they also kind of politically divide us. Can you tell us a little bit about that relationship between Hindi and Urdu?
Yeah. So I don't know how I should start, but yes, Hindi and Urdu for sure share a joint culture, a joint lexicon, and they differ in script clearly, which is one aspect of this division. But for example, for me at York, developing the Hindi program, it was important to me to teach a Hindi hyphen Urdu class where I acknowledge this shared culture and tradition. And yes, the registers will change in time when it comes to literary language, because Urdu, of course, draws more from Arabic and Persian vocabulary, and Hindi will try to draw more from Sanskrit vocabulary. But in my teaching and in my thinking and in the way I perceive language, I think it's really important to be aware that this shared culture is often corrupted maybe by, or let's say politicized by other ideological intentions. But for me it is. And also, I mean, I did a lot of linguistic analysis of the periodicals as well, to just see what pool are these short stories or these writings drawing from. And the women's journals were not Sanskritized language, even though the 1920s, I mean, we're in the midst of all the political language debates. So much revolves around language. But this is something that, again, a big political statement in these women's journals, that they consciously chose a language that could be understood by their readers and that consisted of many, many Urdu words.
Thank you. I have one last question before I hand it over to Ms. Roy. So imagine one of the writers from Sudha back in the 1920s, and this writer arrived in India 2021, and they heard Hinglish. What would their reaction be to Hinglish and the translanguaging that you see amongst the youth in India today?
I think language changes all the times, and I think that's totally fine. So I don't want to stand here as a purist or anything, but I think I'm just so in love with the language of the 20s and of this women's language. It is just so beautiful to me that I don't know. I mean, a woman from the 1920s may find this language modern too. I'm not too sure. For me, what is important is, can it be understood? Can you communicate what you need to communicate with your language? Or why are you talking the way you're talking or writing the way you're writing? I'm not so sure. I really don't want to judge, but I have my opinion. It's the same when I communicate in German, or code switching. I mean, these are things. Sometimes they come normally. Sometimes they happen because you're just lazy and don't want to think of the word. But it depends on your own values and how you want to talk, I find.
Thank you. I'm going to hand the baton back to Ms. Roy.
Thank you, Samina. And thank you for reading my work. I'm so glad that you enjoyed it.
Very much so. I love semiotics and textual analysis. So
what linguistics do you teach?
I just teach a general course in linguistics, but I make references to other languages in that course.
Oh, okay.
So, ma'am, I would like to know how these emancipatory and liberatory women's periodicals that you were talking about in the Hindi public sphere, with its diverse modes of transmission, offering a new historical visibility of individual women and women collectives, strengthen your diasporic sensibilities.
I don't think they strengthen my diasporic identity or sensitivity. These were women in the 20s. For me, it's just important to share my research on women's literary activism, on their writing, and I'm sharing it with my students, what is very important to me, and in the academic world. But it doesn't, I'm not that, I'm passionate, but I'm not emotionally connected to those Indian women, saying that I'm walking like on their path. They didn't pave the way for me. Yeah, I think these are still two different. Yeah, it's my field of research. Put it that way.
Okay, okay. So, ma'am, if you could also share with us your experiences of teaching Hindi in a foreign land, and the students, like, where are the majority from? Are they from India, or are they from a different tongue, coming to the York University to study Hindi? Like, in that case, how do you receive them, and vice versa?
Mm-hmm. So that's interesting because 90% of my students have some South Asian background. One could define or categorize them as heritage learners. They bring some knowledge into the classroom. And when I first started, Hindi and Urdu, or Hindi was taught as a foreign language for the traditional foreign language learner. Even at Berkeley it was that way too. So the two things I did was first hyphenate Hindi with Urdu, that we're
Okay.
teaching Hindi Urdu, teaching the Hindi script in the first year, the Urdu script in the second year. And so that was one thing. And then the second thing was the heritage component, because students, and this took me a while to learn this and to really feel comfortable in my teaching style. I had to change my teaching style because students shouldn't be asked to hide what they're bringing into class, right? So yes, there might be a small group of students who said, oh, let me take Hindi because I know Hindi. But that's a minority. Those students who came to the class were genuinely interested in learning the language. And mostly it was just they didn't have the confidence to speak in front of others, even though they understood everything. And of course, that's exactly what happened to me with Punjabi. So I could understand, but I didn't speak as a child. I was way too shy. So providing these students a welcoming space in the classroom to develop, especially their conversational skills, while always emphasizing the importance of grammar. I'm very traditional in terms of the lexicon, the words we use, and also grammar, because that's how I learned all my foreign languages, and that gave me confidence and comfort and security when I talk. So, but at the same time, I've really changed my teaching style towards encouraging conversation and expression rather than checking grammar and spelling mistakes. So, and then, but as I told before, when we started chatting a little bit, I teach Hindi literature and Urdu literature, and actually South Asian literature in different vernaculars in English translation. So I have many courses on either literature on a specific writer or an overview class. So mostly overview classes where I make selections, or I have a course just on women's literature, on female literary activism, where literature is available in vernacular languages, but students in English translation.
That's so good to know, ma'am. So thank you very much for your time and for sharing with us your knowledgeable insights. And so, with this, we end the conversation.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you, Samina and Deyasini, for your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Bye.